In this particular segment, we will look at a meeting between Prime Minister Netanyahu and a quartet envoy, Tony Blair, who meet in this particular setting. This is toward the early part of the onset of this war. This is toward the mid of July. And the narrative at this point, remember, being circulated is that the 3 children that were actually kidnapped sort of set on this particular war. Of course, at this point, and this is the end of July 2014, and we know that that story was a falsely manufactured story. The kidnapping actually was not done by Hamas, but it was done by a rogue group. So we will use that particular pretext in order to interrogate this narrative that is circulated here. We will also ask the question about the implication of Tony Blair standing side by side with Benjamin Netanyahu, and what does that suggest about the relationship between Israel and the Western world.
I think the brutal abduction of 3 Israeli teenagers shows the true face of Hamas. It's not only committed to murdering Israelis, it's committed to kidnapping children.
So the brutal kidnapping of 3 Israeli teenagers becomes the pretext of the story, but it also becomes the pretext for portraying Hamas and Gaza within the context of a broader commitment to murder, to violence, to terror. So the fundamental premise of this story is built upon the kidnapping. And yet, much like the weapons of mass destruction frames we saw within the context of Iraq, there is no interrogation, both globally as well as in terms of the mainstream media, of this particular link. There is actually zero commitment to fact, to truth, to the question of evidence, and to holding Israel accountable to the manufacturing of this particular lie that then becomes the pretext for the war.
And I think the international community has to condemn Hamas for its terrorist activities. I think it has to support Israel's right of self-defense.
So that becomes again the pretext for one particular kind of rhetoric, a rhetoric that calls upon the international community to condemn Hamas and to stand by Israel for its right to protect. In this context then, if now the evidence points to us that indeed these kidnappings were not really conducted by Hamas. Hamas really didn't have a role to play within the context of these kidnappings. This raises vital questions about this notion of Israel's right to protect itself and this particular narrative being deployed to support this invasion.
And I think it also must call on President Abbas to end his pact with Hamas. Anybody who supports peace must tell the Palestinian Authority that they cannot build a government that is backed by the kidnappers of children and the murderers of innocents.
Pay attention once again to the circulation of the kidnappers of children frame. This particular frame of kidnappers of children is again deployed to call upon the Palestinian authorities to dissociate from Hamas. So again, within that context, if this particular logic link is proven to be untrue, is proven to be not based upon evidence, this entire story falls apart.
First of all, I'd like to express my outrage at what has happened, the kidnap of 3 young people, and to express my deepest sympathy to their families at this moment, who must be going through a great deal of agony and grief. And as well as expressing the complete condemnation of the international community towards this abduction, to say that the only way we're ever going to achieve peace is on the basis that all parts of Palestinian politics are committed to peaceful means and to the recognition that we'll only have peace based on 2 states, a secure state of Israel and a viable state of Palestine.
Tony Blair then picks up the narrative circulated by Netanyahu, without questioning it. But again, we know that Blair has a history of doing this when we look at the narrative of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and it's the repetition of the same kind of articulation that is not based on evidence, that is not based on interrogation, but the circulation of a broader rhetoric. But also, pay attention to Blair's positioning of himself as a spokesperson for the international community. Which international community? Who puts him in this position of power to be the voice of the international community? And what does he refer to when he takes his articulative stance of being the spokesperson for an international community? Once he has taken the stance as a designated spokesperson for the international community, he then goes on to condemn the kidnapping and utilizing that as a basis for articulating the notion of a secure Israel. Note also in Blair's narrative this notion of a secure Israel vis-a-vis viable Palestine. Note the use of the term secure within the context of Israel, viable within the context of Palestine. This also then demonstrates the ways in which Blair positions himself vis-a-vis Israel and within the context of the broader politics in the region.
That means that for Hamas, they have a very clear choice to make. There cannot be a choice that has a political engagement on the one hand and violence on the other. And the only way this is ever going to work is if all violence stops. The terrorism, the kidnappings, the killings. So I think this is a very important moment, and one in which it's right to express our shock and horror at what has happened, but also to say that the only way forward will be when Hamas understands that the only proper choice to make if you want peace is to engage solely in peaceful means to achieve political ends.
We will wrap up our deconstruction of this narrative by looking at this key segment, the moment of the intervention that then is supported by the so-called international community that Tony Blair seeks to represent, is a moment that is based upon these kidnappings of the Israeli teenagers that becomes the basis for the construction and reproduction of a narrative of violence and kidnapping that is supposedly perpetuated by Hamas without really presenting the evidence. To the contrary, when you actually look at the evidence and you look at the amount of deaths, the amount of casualties that have actually been constituted in these two sides of this very unequal war, you find that these deaths are actually extremely disproportionate. So if we talk about the question of peace, it raises vital questions about who is disrupting the peace, who is protecting the peace, what is the notion of peace, peace according to whom. So when we look at this broader question of politics and the narratives that are utilized and deployed within political structures, we have to keep coming back to the question of truth, the ways in which rhetoric often is circulated in ways that is far away from the truth, and then we have to come back to the question, what happens when the particular rhetoric that is dissociated from the truth is found to be as such dissociated from the truth. In other words, when we find that particular structures that are narrating a particular story are doing so on the basis of lies or are doing so without having the evidence at hand, the question for the international community truly is, how do we hold these structures accountable for the lies that they disseminate? How do we hold them accountable to the broader actions they take on the basis of lies that they disseminate? So connecting back to the Iraq story, for instance, once the international community did find out that the weapons of mass destruction frame did not really have a viable basis that was deployed consistently as a justification for Operation Iraqi Freedom, what is the role of the international community to hold the US and UK responsible and accountable? In a similar kind of context with Israel, if we find out that with Operation Protection Edge, there isn't really that much support for the narratives that were initially deployed in order to justify the violence, in order to serve as a rationale for the violence, the question then again for the international community is, how do we hold these structures accountable to these questions of truth and to the frames that are circulated around the evidence that is presented to us?